Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gary Parker. I'm the Associate Dean for External Affairs at the Brown School at Washington University, where I also have the great privilege of being the inaugural director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute. And welcome to Open Classroom. And in fact, this is yet another of our co-produced open classrooms with the American Academy for Social Work and Social Welfare. And we're very happy to have them as our co-producer today. We have really an exciting event. It's, I think, our first virtual book release. Can we call it a party? Can we call it an event? Book release event party. Either way, we have a fantastic speaker, really wonderful Mark Rank. But before, I don't want to get too ahead of myself. First, I want to let you know that we are simulcasting this on YouTube. I'm going to put a link in the chat. Feel free to post or tweet or let folks know. I have found that when folks do post those, that our numbers on YouTube do considerably go up. So there are folks that may need just a simple reminder that they can join us at any moment via YouTube. Also, your cameras and microphones are disabled, so we can't see or hear you, but we certainly want you to be a part of today's event. So at any moment, please feel free to put in the chat questions, comments. I've also seen folks post links to resources that they think might be helpful on the topic. So please take full advantage. If you just want that information to come to us, you just select all panelists. If you want to share that information with everyone here, you can do the selection at the chat that says all panelists and attendees. We have just under 1,100 RSVPs today, which makes this the most responded to event this year and one of the most we've had in the history of Open Classroom, which I think speaks to the real interest in hearing from Mark Rank today. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to my co-host, Janet Gillow, the Director of Professional Development.
Thank you so much, Gary, and welcome everyone. Before transitioning to today's event, which I know is what brought everybody here, I just want to take the opportunity to invite you to some of what we have coming up at Open Classroom. It's a very busy time for us. We're going to be back on tomorrow, launching a series that we're doing on the COVID vaccine in St. Louis, and we have just an amazing panel. We have Dr. Alex Garza, we have Lisa Clancy from the County Council, people that are really right at the forefront of getting the vaccine to people here in the St. Louis community, ready to share information and answer your questions. So I definitely encourage you to sign up if you're local or if you're interested in the St. Louis response. And that's just the first of several offerings that we have related to the COVID vaccine. We're back on Thursday. Gary Parker, my extremely talented co-host, and my colleague Atia Thurman are giving a talk on community organizing, and that's also going to be fantastic. And the pace just keeps continuing. We have events next week, including a new one that we're adding for Thursday. You guys are the first to hear about it, and we're going to be in your inbox super quick because we want to let people know about it. Dr. Ross Hammond has done just cutting edge science on modeling containment of COVID. We have the vaccines, we have the variants. How are these two things coming together, and what do we need to do to be safe and return to better days? So I am so excited for the application of that science and just invite you to be a part of that conversation. But now let's talk about today's conversation. And to lead us off, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dean Mary McKay, who's the Nydorf Family and Centene Corporation Dean of the Brown School and also the president of AASWSW. Mary.
So Gary, thank you. Janet, thank you. It is my privilege to welcome hundreds of you here to this co-sponsored event between Washington University and St. Louis, the Brown School, and the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. So I can say a lot incredibly complimentary things about my colleague, Mark Rank. And I'm going to just tell you a couple because I want, Mark, you to talk about this book, which comes in a series of books that you have written that contributed to this really poignant discussion around poverty and how we understand what are the evidence-based solutions to address this incredibly important issue. So Mark, you know, you're my colleague at the Brown School. You are the Adley, Professor of Social Welfare. And I have to tell you, before I was the dean, Mark, I knew your work. I followed that work in poverty studies. And so you know that you've been an incredibly important voice around inequality, around social justice. And so this book follows in that long line of contributions that you've made. I'm also really happy that you were early inducted into the Academy in 2012. And so you represent the very best of scholars in our profession. And so I'm so glad to be representing those scholars and the Academy Board here today as the president. So you have used, I think, this experience of challenge to also have you write and contribute. And really what you're going to hear today, I know, audience, is going to be provocative, is going to be clear, and it's going to tackle some of the myths and stereotypes that have been really kind of elevated in today's rhetoric. And Mark's going to walk us through how we can cut through the misunderstandings around poverty. So with that, my colleague, thank you so much for representing your work and for being in relationship with all of us electronically. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Mary. Thanks for that introduction. And I'd like to welcome everyone here as well. This is really the first time that I've had a chance to talk about the new book in public. So I'm really pleased to be able to do this with friends and with colleagues around the country and some folks from around the world. What I'd like to do is take a few minutes and go over what the book is about, and then we'll open things up for questions that you may have about this book. So let me say just a couple words kind of dealing with the impetus behind doing this. It was about 2 years ago, and my co-author, Lawrence Eppert, and I were on the phone one day, and Lawrence mentioned how there's never been a book focused around debunking the many myths around poverty in the United States. And as you are very well aware, I'm sure there are many, many myths and stereotypes surrounding poverty. But to our knowledge, there hadn't been a book that specifically focused on addressing those myths. And we both thought that this would be a really interesting and important book that should be written. So the two of us, along with our other co-author, Heather Bullock, put together a list of some of the most widespread myths surrounding poverty, welfare, and inequality, and the result is the book that's before us now. The book itself is divided into 6 parts or sections. The first 5 sections are organized around addressing the different myths of poverty, welfare, and inequality, while the last section, or the final section, asks, why do these myths continue despite evidence to the contrary? And what can we do to move beyond them? So let me walk through these sections of the book and then finish up with some overall thoughts. We began by asking the question of, who are the poor? And one of the most widely held myths by the general public is that poverty is an issue of them and not an issue of us. That poverty tends to occur to a relatively small group of Americans, often living in poverty-stricken communities, and will never affect me personally. So in the opening chapter, we present some of the life course research that I've conducted, showing that in actuality, a majority of the population will at some point find themselves in poverty or near poverty. Furthermore, a majority of Americans will at some point turn to the social safety net for help. And 80% of Americans will encounter a year of significant economic turmoil between the ages of 25 and 60. Consequently, poverty is something that will actually affect most of us directly at some point in our lives. A second myth regarding who the poor are is that most households in poverty live in highly impoverished inner city neighborhoods. Well, it turns out that only about 10 to 15% of those in poverty live in high poverty neighborhoods. Furthermore, there are now more people in poverty living in suburban areas than there are in central cities. And some of the most entrenched poverty in America is found in rural America. Another myth around who experiences poverty is that most who do so are in poverty for a long time. It turns out that the typical spell of poverty is only a couple of years. Folks tend to be in poverty for a fairly short period of time, but then they may experience another spell of poverty at some point down the road. So poverty is much more fluid than the static picture of an entrenched class. And a final myth that we take on in this section is the one that poverty is simply a black or a brown problem, that most in poverty are folks of color. It turns out that while it is certainly true that non-whites are at a much higher risk of experiencing poverty than whites, the largest group in poverty actually are whites. And we argue that Americans routinely view poverty through the lens of race, and as a result are often hostile to the poor. So this first section of the book underscores the idea that the reach of poverty is actually quite wide. It can be found across the United States down just about any block or street. The next section of the book turns to the question of why is there poverty? And the way that Americans have often understood why poverty occurs is that it's the result of some kind of an individual failing or shortcoming. So people just aren't working hard enough. They've made bad decisions in their lives. They haven't gotten enough education or skills and so on. And the argument that we make in this section is that poverty in reality is a structural failing rather than an individual failing. And the analogy used here is the one that I've used in previous work, and that is of musical chairs. So I argue that a helpful way to understand poverty is as a game of musical chairs. So picture a game of musical chairs with 10 players, but only 8 chairs available. The players circle around and the music stops. Who loses out? Well, if we focus on the characteristics of who didn't get a chair, we can point to the losers not being fast enough, not as agile, in a bad position when the music stopped. And all of these can be given for why those 2 individuals lost out. But if we step back and look at the structure of the game, then 2 people are going to lose out regardless of what their characteristics are. In this sense, those characteristics only explain who loses out, not why there are losers in the first place. And what we've been doing in this country with respect to poverty is focusing on who loses out at the game rather than why the game produces losers in the first place. Poverty, for the most part, is the result of economic and political structural failings. This includes the fact that the economy has been producing more and more low-wage jobs without benefits that can't support a family. It includes the fact that our safety net is incredibly weak compared to other countries. And it includes the fact that we don't provide things like universal health care, childcare, or affordable housing that other countries routinely provide. The result is that the game is structured such that a significant percentage of the population will lose out. Now, the losers tend to have characteristics that put them at a greater risk of low income, such as less education and skills. But those characteristics only explain who in particular loses out, not why the game produces losers in the first place. And our argument is that poverty is ultimately the result of not nearly enough decent opportunities for everyone in this country. In the next section of the book, we address the cost of poverty. And a widespread myth is that the poor in America are really not that bad off. And beyond that, it's just too expensive to try and reduce poverty in the first place. Well, what we show is that poverty in the US is much more widespread than in all of the other OECD countries in Europe and other places, and that the depth of poverty in the US is also more extreme. We also discuss some of the research that I've done on childhood poverty. And a conservative estimate of the annual economic cost of childhood poverty is slightly over $1 trillion per year, which is over a quarter of the entire federal budget. In addition, for every dollar we spend on reducing childhood poverty, we would save up to $12 in the future by reducing the costs of such poverty. So the segment or the argument in this section of the book is that the myth of poverty not being expensive or problematic is dead wrong. Okay, the next section of the book, we turn to a topic that probably has the most stereotypes and misconceptions of all, and that is welfare and the safety net. And epitomizing these stereotypes is the trope of the welfare queen. The image is of a woman with a multitude of children living the good life on her generous benefits. She relaxes during the day and parties at night with the understanding that she's entitled to everything received. She has no intention of ever working and serves as a role model for her many children. Well, we demonstrate in this section that this stereotype is flat out wrong. First of all, the amount received from welfare is meager. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to try and live on these programs. Second, welfare fraud is extremely low. We examine the rates of fraud in the SNAP program and find them to be much lower than in other government programs. In addition, we show that safety net programs can have a very positive effect on reducing poverty. Ronald Reagan was famous for saying, "We fought a war on poverty and poverty won," or that government is not the solution, government is the problem. Well, it turns out that poverty was cut in half during the war on poverty in the 1960s. We've also seen a significant reduction of poverty among the elderly over the past 60 years as a direct result of government programs such as Social Security and Medicare. And there are many other examples today in OECD countries in which they are very proactive in reducing their rates of poverty through their safety nets. Okay, we get then to the last section dealing with myths, and that looks at the wider issue of inequality. The idealized image of America is one of abundant opportunities where anyone who works hard can climb a ladder of success. There's a belief in the notion of equality of opportunity, that the playing field is roughly level, and therefore everyone has an equal chance to do well. There's also the belief that America represents a meritocracy, such that those at the top deserve it, and those at the bottom deserve their fate as well. We show that this image of America, if it ever was true, is true no longer. Economic mobility in the US is actually less than it is in many other countries. As income has gotten wider, the rungs on the ladder of opportunity have gotten further apart, making it more difficult for children to do well economically as adults. And it's clearly the case that children raised in low income and families of color have much less opportunities and chances to get ahead. The growing levels of inequality in society have also resulted in a number of negative outcomes for the United States. These would include higher rates of incarceration, greater levels of anxiety and mistrust, and lower economic productivity for the country as a whole. So that's a kind of a summary of the first 5 sections of the book, which are dealing with these different myths. We then get to the final section of the book. And here we ask the question, if there's so much evidence against all of these myths, why do they continue? Why do people continue to believe the myths and stereotypes around poverty, welfare, and inequality? Well, my co-author, Heather Bullock, she addresses this in terms of psychological reasons, such as how stereotypes and misconceptions are formed and maintained. But let me mention a few of the more sociological reasons that I discuss in this particular chapter. One of the things that I argue is, let's step back and look at who might be benefiting from the perpetuation of these myths. And if we do this, several groups I think immediately come to mind. First of all, politicians have routinely used these myths to score political points. Ronald Reagan did that, Bill Clinton did that, Donald Trump did that, and many, many others as well. Using these myths to portray the poor as takers and not makers has appealed to the conservative segment of America's voting population. Second, these myths provide the justification for the continuation of the status quo of rising inequality, which serves the interests of those with money and power. The myths suggest that nothing needs to be done to address poverty because it's the result of individual failure, while those at the top deserve all the wealth and income that has come their way. The myths therefore support the status quo of extreme inequality in the United States. Finally, the myths work against poor people organizing collectively to fight for their common interests. The myths serve to divide people, particularly with respect to race. The result is a lack of collective action, which could put pressure on those in power. And this has certainly benefited business and corporate interests who have wanted to keep their labor costs low and their profits high. In all of these cases I've just mentioned, politicians, the wealthy, corporate America, each of them wield considerable power. It's therefore not just a question of various groups benefiting from the myths, but who in particular benefits and to what extent are they able to shape the narrative. Each of these groups in various ways is able to influence the discussion around poverty and inequality. So we then get to the second to last chapter, which discusses what needs to be done to move forward and alleviate poverty. The argument is that we need policies and initiatives that focus on the structure of the game. This would include increasing the number of jobs that pay a living wage, raising the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour, along with increasing the earned income tax credit. It includes providing the kinds of supports necessary to lead a livable life, such as healthcare, childcare, affordable housing, and quality education for all children. It includes having a safety net that protects people from poverty rather than punishing people who fall into poverty. It includes policies that help low-income earners assets such that they can access them in the future to move forward in their lives. All of these ideas and policies would begin to fundamentally reduce the risk of poverty in the United States. And so we get to the final question that we take up in the book, and that is, do we have the political and collective will to do so? And on this question, I would say that I've become guardedly optimistic. Over the last 10 years, there's been a rising awareness of inequality in the United States, beginning with the Occupy movement in 2011 and 2012, where the protests focused on the 1% and the 99%. More recently, the Black Lives Matter movement has gained considerable traction in showing the vast inequalities in the US around race and ethnicity. And there's now talk in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party of ideas such as a universal basic income. And just in the last few weeks, both President Biden and Senator Romney have proposed a child allowance as a way of helping to reduce poverty. Now, a few years ago, these ideas and proposals would have been viewed as completely unrealistic, but today they're part of the conversation. All of these, I think, are hopeful signs that we are beginning to shift our understanding of poverty as an issue of not of them, but as an issue of us. The myths need to be replaced with a moral and an economic urgency that poverty can and must be eradicated. And we in the social work profession should seize upon this momentum to advocate strongly for progressive policies that will help to dramatically cut the rate of poverty in the United States. And so let me end my comments with a couple of paragraphs. Whenever you do a book reading, you're always supposed to read from the book. And so let me take the last few paragraphs and just read this. And I'm going to put on my glasses to do that. As you get older, you need these. And so this is coming to the end of the book. And let me just read a bit here. We say more than 130 years ago, the damaging effects of American poverty were documented in Jacob Riis's landmark 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives. Riis detailed in both words and photographs the impoverished conditions of tenement families in an area known as the Bend in New York City. He wrote about the difficulty of eliminating the wretched conditions of those living in that neighborhood. There were times when it appeared very little was being accomplished. Yet as Riis observed regarding such feelings of discouragement, and now quoting from Riis, when nothing seems to help, I go and look at a stonecutter hammering away at his rock, perhaps 100 times, without as much as a crack showing in it. Yet at the 101st blow, it will split in two. And I know that it was not that blow that did it, but all that had gone before. And let me just read the last couple paragraphs from the book here. We began this book by noting that there are few subjects with as many myths, stereotypes, and misperceptions surrounding them as poverty in America. Throughout these pages, we have sought to set the record straight. We have looked at who actually experiences poverty, why poverty exists, the costs of poverty, what the facts are regarding the social safety net, and the realities of the wider context of inequality in America. We encourage you, our readers, to use this information as a valuable tool in creating the kinds of change we have been discussing in this chapter. Diagnosing the scope and cause of a problem is a first step toward addressing that problem. A second step is using that diagnosis to shift the prevailing status quo mentality to one of social action. A third step is building the momentum to leverage a change in how we address the problem. Ultimately, such change begins with each of us. As Margaret Mead once poignantly remarked, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So as we look into the future, let us create a community and a country that are transformed by the knowledge that poverty can and must be eradicated once and for all. And so I'll bring my comments to a close and we can open things up for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Mark. I am so looking forward to getting my copy of Poorly Misunderstood. And while we're talking about the book, I'm going to put a link in the chat. We have a exclusive offer to open classroom participants. The publisher has provided a code that will give you 30% off the book. So I've put that into the chat feature for those of you who are interested. So Mark, what kept going through my head, and even before I get to Mark, please continue to send us your questions. Janet and I are curating them, and that we will, we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. And thank you too for these, because already the questions that have been coming in are incredibly thoughtful. So we're going to have a great discussion. Mark, one of the things that just kept going through my head as you were talking about is that basically, the movements that we're seeing on both the right and the left are upset about the same thing.
Yeah.
This like lack of opportunity to education, to health, to high paying or jobs that pay a living wage. But it's where they lay the blame for poverty, the poverty that they're experiencing, that goes into two different directions. On the right, there's more of the structural view that says that there's a game of musical chairs where two people are always,
on the left.
Yes, on the left. Thank you. On the left, that they're saying there's a game of musical chairs and two people are always going to get left out, and there's a systematic problem here. And then you have those who are on the right who are saying, it's not that. It's the fact that there are populations of folks that are either taking those opportunities or, eliminating those opportunities for others. And they lay the blame at more vulnerable populations when you look at a societal totem pole of oppression. How do we engage in a dialogue that says, listen, we're interested in the same things here. We want the same things. So how do we unify this understanding of the causes of poverty?
Yeah, Gary, I mean, you're exactly on target that that both folks on the left and right have been feeling this, what we might call economic stagnation over the last 50 years or so. If you look at, for example, median wages for men working full time, in real dollars, they were higher in 1973 than they are today. And so people are working, but they're not getting ahead. So how do we, I guess what we do is, at least us in the academy, is we should bring evidence and research to bear. Now, some folks, you're never going to change their minds. They're set in their ways, but I do think there is a role for looking at something with a clear vision, and finding trying to find what the underlying explanation is. And as I said, the evidence is overwhelming that that poverty is a structural failing. And we can talk about all kinds of things, but I think it's our sort of obligation in the academy and also as social workers to bring this knowledge and this information into the public debate and into the political debate. So, if somebody is simply guided by ideology, then it's hard to convince them. But I think, again, our role is to really, we're sort of steeped in the idea of evidence-based practice and bringing that to the fore. So,
yeah. We have our friend Trish Cole, who said that who wanted to share that she received her copy of the book yesterday and has already been diving into it. And Esther says that hers is on the way as well. What is your thought about really forward-thinking policy solutions like a universal income? Do you think that's one of the solutions here?
So it's a really interesting idea, and it's actually an idea that has long legs to it. Thomas Paine in 1776 proposed this idea. Richard Nixon proposed this idea in the early 70s and almost became law. So the idea goes back a long ways. I think it's a really interesting idea to think about, particularly in the future when we have, more automation, more artificial intelligence. There might not be as many jobs out there as there are today. But I do think that it is a hard sell in the United States because, we're steeped in sort of the rugged individual ideology and the idea that you don't give people something for nothing. So I think that's it's a hard sell. However, as I mentioned, both President Biden and Senator Romney have proposed a child allowance, which is a variation on the universal basic income. So the idea there is if you have a child, we're going to provide you with some assistance to help raise that child, regardless of where you fall in terms of income. And European countries have had this for decades. So I think that's a good way to kind of start thinking about this. The other way to think about it is if poverty is a lack of income, then a very straightforward way is to provide people with more income. Yeah. So I think that it's something that should be part of the discussion. I think it's part of, as I said before, creating jobs that pay a livable wage, getting minimum wage up, this kind of thing. So it's an interesting idea, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes in the future because people have been talking about it, certainly in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party.
So Mark, there seems to be in the chat just a little bit of confusion about what this means. But when we're talking about universal income, we're not saying that a doctor and a grocery store clerk should be earning the same amount of money.
You mean
Is that what-
getting the same amount of money from a universal basic income?
Well, would that do?
So the idea behind a universal basic income is that everybody gets a certain amount of income. Now, as I said, that's that may be a hard sell, but that's the idea. The child allowance that is being proposed. I think that for Senator Romney is everybody up to about $400,000 of income would get a child allowance. So it's a pretty generous kind of idea, and it gets to this notion of, should a program be targeted or should it be universal? And there are trade-offs with both of those. A program that's universal always has more popular support, like Social Security. However, it's more expensive to do that than to target a program at a specific population group, say below a certain income level. So there's trade-offs involved there, but the sort of the pure universal basic income would be giving everybody a certain amount of income every year, regardless of what their income is.
In addition to the income that they're bringing in,
That's
is that
right.
it?
That's
Okay,
right.
that's it. Okay. So Kim has a question. In your opinion, where would be the best place to start equalizing socioeconomic status? Her opinion is quality education, but wanted to get what your thoughts were.
I think that's the one that just jumped into my mind with this question. I think if we look at educational quality in the United States, we see vast at the K to 12 level. We see vast differences depending on where children, where they're growing up, their race, their ethnicity, and that's just wrong. And one of the things about the United States that's unusual is how we fund education at the K through 12 level. We fund it largely through local property taxes and real estate taxes, so that a wealthy community has a lot of resources to invest in their school district. A poor community has much less. Most countries don't do that. Most countries fund from kind of a central, federal level. And the result of that is that we have these wide differences in the kinds of educational quality that children are getting. So I think that what Kim was saying, I think it's a really good place to start in terms of dealing with some of these inequities, is trying to ensure that every child in this country gets a really good education. And I'm going on and on, but another reason to do that is because it makes our society better. It makes us, first of all, more economically productive. It makes us more innovative by doing that. And so there's a real self-interest argument here as well. Not only is it the morally right thing to do, but it's also the economically right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And here's another great question. This is from Denise. How do you, when you're engaging in these conversations, combat the negative connotations or the defense of socialism? It seems to be the reaction to talking about poverty that it is immediately taken and stereotyping negative socialist societies.
Well, I guess you could say, is Norway a socialist country? No, it's a socialist democratic country. I guess I would say, to kind of argue against that, that if you look at some of the most robust economies in the last 20 years, they've been countries like Germany, the Netherlands, Norway. These are all countries that invest in their social safety net, that invest in their programs. Now, call it socialism or whatever you want to call it, but I call it investing in people. And as I just said, that actually makes the society more productive. So, and that's a very, I don't know, that just seems like a very intuitive and sort of straightforward kind of argument to make, that investing in our human capital is really important in terms of our overall well-being as a society.
I just wanted to share that we're just getting some notes that although it speaks to the demand of your book, Mark, that they are already out of stock. However, they're still taking orders for folks who are interested in, and when they are back up, I'm sure it might have something to do with supply chain, who knows, or just demand. Mark, another bestseller on your way.
There you go. I'm gonna auction off the movie rights for this.
Okay. All right. Here's another a great question. This one is from Sinir, who says, do people perpetuate the myths to keep themselves in power? And do they know they are doing so? And is there any research out there that says this is something they are explicitly doing or implicitly doing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So in this chapter that I mentioned about why the myths persist, one of the things I write about is, it may not be the case that corporate America sits around the boardroom and thinks about, how can we perpetuate these poverty myths? On the other hand, the perpetuation of those myths dovetails with some of the interests of corporate America. So, it's hard to say, do people actually consciously do this or not? I think the end result is the same. And the end result is that, if we think about this wider issue of inequality, and if we think about the overall mythology, is that, well, this is a meritocracy, and those at the top deserve it, and those at the bottom deserve it. Well, that's a nice justification for keeping everything at the top. And so, it definitely is to the advantage of those at the top to have these myths continue. Whether they do it consciously or not, that I don't know, and I don't have an answer to. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Great. We're still accepting questions. If you have questions for Mark Rank on his book, Poorly Misunderstood, we definitely want to hear from you. Mark, we've been talking mostly from a kind of federal perspective. Are you aware of anything that's happening locally in St. Louis that you think is making headways towards addressing, the poverty rates in the region?
Yeah, well, Gary, you might know, we could turn this on you. You might know some of those things. I know that, there are some really nice examples of folks kind of working on the community level, the Beyond Housing group in Normandy and places like that. But Gary, you might have some answers to that.
Well, I think there's I certainly couldn't write a book on this, Mark, but there are a lot of folks who are, one of the things that I really love about being in St. Louis is that there are an incredible number of really thoughtful, intelligent, committed folks who are working tirelessly to look at these issues, to look at poverty, to look at structural racism. And I think that one of the great things is that we are actually, today is a mayoral primary day in St. Louis. And a lot of the candidates have been talking about a lot of the plans that they are putting forth. So this is an exciting time to be in St. Louis and looking at these issues.
Yeah, the other thing I would say about thinking about this is a lot of the, when we think about the problems that St. Louis has, and any community really, a lot of those problems go back to the issues of poverty. If we think about crime, there's a big concern about that. A lot of that goes back to conditions of poverty. And so by dealing with poverty, we actually we actually are able to prevent some of these problems down the road. That's the argument that I make in reducing childhood poverty, that you can pay for the problem on the front end of the problem or on the back end of the problem. And what we're doing in this country is we're paying for poverty on the back end. We're putting people away, incarcerating people. We have higher healthcare costs. We're less economically productive. That's really expensive to do. It's much more effective to deal with poverty on the front end and prevent children from falling into poverty.
Mm-hmm. Mark, I also want to elevate another point that you made earlier, which is when you're looking at absolute numbers, in terms of absolute numbers, there are actually more white people in the United States that are living in poverty. However, we at the same time need to recognize that within communities of color, due to structural racism, that they are disproportionately impacted.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting is that often these poverties or these policies that were created and based in racism to try and hold down a class of folks are unable to be contained within a certain population, and therefore the impact of those racist policies is felt by all.
Yeah, that's a great point for sure. And as you said at the beginning, both of those things are correct. So the largest group in poverty are whites because they're the largest single group in terms of the population. But if you're folks of color, you're at a much greater risk of experiencing poverty. So and just to sort of to kind of go off on that, let me see if I can find this here. It's the issue of race has been used over and over to divide poor whites and poor blacks. This has been true in the South and other places as well. And there's a great quote from let's see, I think I got it here, from Lyndon Johnson about this. So this is from 1960, and Lyndon Johnson was talking to an aide and talking about race and poverty. And he says to the aide, he says, "I'll tell you what's at the bottom of it. If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you." And that's what we've been doing in this country over and over again. And that's, again, part of the mythology, part of the myth.
Mark, there's a question about, how you define a living wage.
Yeah, so there's a great website at MIT. It's called Living Wage Calculator. And you can go to that. It's a researcher, Amy Glassmeyer, has developed that. And what she does is she looks at all these different areas in the United States and figures out, okay, what does it cost to rent a 2-bedroom apartment? What does it cost for all kinds of things? And based upon that, what kind of wage do you need to survive on? So, obviously that's going to differ widely. If you're in San Francisco or New York versus St. Louis, it's going to be a living wage has got to be a lot higher than it is here. But I would tell everybody listening in, that's a great tool that's out there that you can look at your community wherever you are and see sort of what a living wage would be.
And Grace has a question. She says, how can we educate about understanding poverty among rural and urban citizens who often see these things so differently?
I have there was a little questionnaire that my publisher kind of put together on this book. And one of the things that I say is that actually the rural poor person in Appalachia and the rural poor person in inner city St. Louis actually has a lot more in common than they might think. In both of those places, there's a collapse of economic opportunities. It's thinking about the musical chairs analogy. They're living in a situation where there are only a few chairs for everybody playing the game. Now, clearly there are differences as well, but again, I think it's those differences that divide us rather than bring us together. We need to think about folks that are suffering in a variety of places and in a variety of areas in this country and start addressing that and start addressing those structural kind of problems.
Just a comment by, it says Galaxy S10. I'm going to assume that's their phone, but I did just want to share with it that this person said working on poverty on the front end, the preventative end, would be a human-focused way of doing things. And I thought that was a really wonderful statement.
That's a nice way of saying it, yeah.
So Kathy's asked a question. Do you know anything about the Poor People's Campaign and what they're doing on poverty?
I do a little bit. I followed that a little bit. I think that I see that they're active and, again, trying to do the same things that we're doing here of getting the word out, trying to move towards progressive kind of policies. I think they're based in DC, and I think they're sort of they're kind of a religious-based organization to some extent.
We have time for just a few more questions, so feel free to keep them coming. Have you looked at Maggie has a question. Have you looked at the relationship between disability and poverty at all?
Well, I did do a study a few years ago, which looked at, I mentioned at the beginning that I've done a lot of work on looking at the life course risk of poverty, but I did a study that looked at the life course risk of disability. And it's actually, when you look over a long period of time, it's actually quite high. It's, I can't remember the exact percentages, but it was something like 30 to 40% of people at some point will develop a disability. So it's really significant. And folks that do have a disability are at a much greater risk of experiencing poverty. I think the figures for last year were something like, if you have a disability that prevents you from, or really alters your lifestyle and your work, about 28% of those folks are live below the poverty line, compared to about 8% of people that don't have 8 or 9% that don't have a disability. So there's a pretty significant relationship between those.
Mm-hmm. So it seems that whenever there's a population that's in a more vulnerable status, whether that is populations of color or those that are disabled or those that are from LGBTQ plus populations, seem to have disproportionate levels of poverty. Have you found that to be true in your research?
So the fact that they fall into these groups, these kind of stigmatized groups, is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And that reflects on, there's a lot of structural discrimination out there that these groups face, and in social work we know about that. I mean, we wrestle with that all the time. So absolutely. But I think again, it's important to keep in mind, the way I like to think about this is that the reach of poverty is actually quite wide. The grip of poverty is not as strong as we might think it is, that people move into poverty, they move out of poverty. But the reach of poverty is really wide, and it affects a lot of us. And that's why I say what we really need to think about is poverty as an issue of us, not an issue of them.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question here. I'm just going to read it to get your thoughts, which is, how do you break the cycle of generational poverty, which seems to be more of a family systems issue?
Well, I think, and this gets to what we remember when I said in my talk that one of the myths of poverty is that, folks who are in poverty are there for long periods of time. It turns out that most people who experience poverty are there for fairly short periods of time. But there is a segment of the population, maybe 10% of folks that are in poverty are there for long periods of time and reflect this kind of generational dynamic. And I think there, we have to think about a range of things. So, we talked about education and providing good education. But I think in those cases, it's, where poverty is really entrenched. We have to think about more kind of proactive policies to get folks out of that situation. But again, I would go back and say that even thinking about that kind of poverty it's very much of a structural kinds of thing, that there just aren't the opportunities for folks to get ahead.
Right. And so it's really less of a failing of a family system and more the result of just structural systems that have built up over generations.
I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
All right, Mark, we have just a few more minutes. I want to give you an opportunity to share some closing thoughts. And this has really been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for doing this with us.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's as I said, it's a pleasure to be able to kind of virtually launch this book for our friends and colleagues and have this here. And I just I just hope that this message gets out. And as I said, I'm guardedly optimistic. I do think that there's been a change in a greater awareness of inequality and poverty, and certainly issues of race over the last 10 years. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to see some movement on some of these things, particularly with the new president. So maybe I'll end my comments there that we have much to be thankful for.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for your time and for really attracting such a really thoughtful and amazing audience today. And I want to thank those who have joined us for your questions. You really brought incredible value and depth to the discussion, and I'm grateful for that. And Mark, again, congratulations. I feel like you're putting out a book every 6 months or so. So I suspect that we'll be doing this again in the near future. And it's always such a great pleasure to spend time with you.
Oh, thanks, Gary, and thank you for the great moderation of this event.
No, thank you for inviting me to do it. All right, folks, thank you again. We're going to sign off, and this video will be posted on the Brown School's YouTube page. Give us just a couple of hours to kind of upload it, and then feel free to post and send around to folks that you think may enjoy today's conversation who weren't able to join us as we were broadcasting it live. So with that, we'll sign off. Thank you again, Mark. Appreciate you.
Thank you.